and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses, planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forests of the growing trees, and I bought male and female slaves. I had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart had found pleasure in all my toil, and all this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done and all the toil that I expended in doing it, and behold, it was vanity, striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for your word. And I just pray that you would help us understand the words of the preacher. Guide us with wisdom as we consider these things this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. What lengths are people willing to go to experience pleasure? One of the advantages of Western civilization, and it might put a question mark as to whether that's an advantage or not. One of the advantages of Western civilization is that this prosperity and economic growth and all the machines that we use, they've created this situation where we have a lot of opportunity to pursue pleasure. And we have the opportunity to do so in ways that some societies around the world do not. I mean, a lot of people in this world are just trying to get by from a day-to-day basis just to survive. There's not a lot of opportunity for them to pursue pleasure in other things. We don't have that issue. And for many in our society and in our culture, in Western culture, pleasure is the ultimate pursuit in life. And that's what we would call a hedonist. The definition of hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure, sensual self-indulgence. That's what hedonism is. Now, there is a philosophy of hedonism, and that is this ethical theory that pleasure, in the sense of satisfaction and desire, or the satisfaction of desire, pleasure is the highest good, and it is the proper aim in life. This philosophy was explored by ancient Greek philosophers. It was made popular in the 18th and 19th century by folks like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And there are still folks around today that espouse these same ideas, although they've been rebranded as utilitarianism and or altruism, things like that. But even so, even going back to the Greek philosophers, they weren't the original ones to come up with this idea. The preacher in Ecclesiastes explored this centuries before. Now, in our series in Ecclesiastes, we've listened as the preacher has explained the beginnings, at least, of his search for meaning in life, his search for purpose and satisfaction. And he's searching in all of the things that men find themselves doing under the sun or while he lives here on earth. Now, here in the first part of chapter 2, he's going to test to see if pleasure can produce what he's looking for. And his conclusion, he comes right out the gate with it. His conclusion is the main idea of our passage. You will not find lasting satisfaction in the pursuit of pleasure. He opens with it, he gives it away, and then he explains the way that he went about it. And that's what we'll see as we work through this passage. He's got this hypothesis that he's testing out. Can any satisfaction, or lasting satisfaction, meaning, purpose, that kind of thing, can it be found in this pursuit of pleasure? And then he's going to experiment. He's going to run a series of tests. He's going to try to find it in a lot of different things. And then he'll tell us in verses 9 and 10 the outcome of all of his testing. And then bring us to a conclusion in verse 11. So let's look at verses 1 through 10. That's where we'll begin. And we've got this hypothesis. The scientific mind, at least a good one anyway, is moved, is encouraged, is spurred on by the questions that one can come up with. And so the question before us that the preacher is going to explore is, can lasting satisfaction be found in the pursuit of pleasure? So here again, we find this preacher he's thinking to himself. He's saying within his heart, right? As his search for meaning and purpose continues. Now, at the end of chapter 1, he has said that wisdom increases vexation and knowledge increases sorrow. So the idea now is to say, let's go in the opposite direction. Let's go to the opposite extreme to see if pleasure will do the trick. And he's going to tell us about some of his exploits and how he pursued things to their very end. He will not hold back. He's going to immerse himself fully in these pursuits. And so the logic behind this is that the only way to know for sure if pleasure will bring lasting satisfaction is to consume as much of it as is possible. Now, this is where we have to be clear. The Bible will tell you what actually happens, oftentimes without commenting on whether the activity is moral or not. The Bible will record historical events, and it will describe people with accuracy, but that doesn't mean that that event or that person was right in what they were doing. Now, what follows and what the preacher says is not necessarily what God endorses. The preacher is going to pursue pleasure in a hedonistic way. And in some cases, he's going to be immoral. But before he even gets to his descriptions of what he did, he gives away his conclusion. I mean, he doesn't even offer us a spoiler alert. It's all vanity. It's like chasing the wind. It's like trying to grab smoke. It all lacks lasting satisfaction. So here we go. Here's the experiment. All right, in verse 3, let's test out the pleasure of wine. You could also say the party lifestyle. Okay, let's test out the pleasure of the party lifestyle. So here we are. First up, living the party life. Wine and folly. That's what we see in verse 3. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of men to do under heaven during the few days of their life. Now, when he talks about the heart, he's talking about the center of his being. Right? So the preacher's going to use all of his human capacities to see if wine is the answer or if it's the source of lasting pleasure and satisfaction. And now he's going to go out about this in a particular way, right? His heart still guiding him with wisdom. So I think that means that he's not going to get completely drunk and then give no thought to why he did what he did or the consequences of his actions. He's going to evaluate these outcomes, the outcome of his little escapade, and he's going to see if there's meaning and purpose and satisfaction at the bottom of the bottle. At the same time, he says, I'm going to try to lay hold on folly. He's going to see if the party life that is often associated with alcohol is worth it. You know, most commercials that we see that aim to sell some sort of alcoholic product seem to portray that party life in their ads. I mean, if the commercials are any indication, then the party lifestyle should bring pleasure, right? Everyone is always having a good time, or at least they look like they are. But I don't know if we have to watch commercials to know this. You know, maybe we've all listened to classmates or coworkers or family members tell about their alcohol-related adventures from the previous weekend. I mean, you can walk around Wisconsin and see T-shirts that say, "Drink Wisconsinly." I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I assume it means that let's go party and enjoy ourselves. So the question is, can that party lifestyle bring any sort of lasting satisfaction? So Solomon is saying, should I, as the wisest man ever and the king of Israel, encourage my subjects, people, to embrace the use of wine as a lifestyle? Well, the preacher's going to test it out for himself and see. Now, what is interesting here is this is a departure from what Solomon, the preacher, has said elsewhere. We've already said that he's the author of Proverbs as well. And in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 19 through 21, and in 29 through 25, he actually addresses the use of wine or alcohol and its effects. So in Proverbs 23, verses 19 and 20, he says, "Hear, my son, be wise and direct your heart in the way. Be not among drunkards, or among gluttonous eaters of meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags." Now, maybe the gluttonous eaters of meat hits too close to home, like right after Thanksgiving, considering we just celebrated that. But anyway, Solomon warns in Proverbs that the party lifestyle can consume a lot of one's wealth. There's an inherent danger that must be accounted for when one engages with wine. But that's not all. Just a few verses down in Proverbs 23, 29 through 35, he says, "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who tarry long over wine, those who go to try mixed wine. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, like one who lies on the top of a mast. They struck me, you will say, but I was not hurt. They beat me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake? I must have another drink." So I think here, what Solomon is exposing is the dark underbelly of drunkenness. I mean, we know that exists. But I don't think we've seen too many commercials that show that side of the party lifestyle. But at best, right? At best, The pleasure of the party lifestyle is very temporary. And at worst, there is much sorrow and emotional pain as well as physical pain that comes with this sort of pursuit of pleasure. And so for the preacher, the pursuit of wine, the pursuit of the party lifestyle did not produce any sort of lasting satisfaction. And so he'll test the pleasure of economic development. This is what we see in verses 4 through 7. He says in verse 4, I made great works. I built houses and I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made pools from which to water the forest and grow trees. I bought male and female slaves. I had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. Now, one way in which we can pursue pleasure and meaning is through, economic conquest. From construction projects to agricultural development to large ranches to multi-generational workforces that we need, to run it all. Now, what we have here, what the preacher talks about here is 4 decades of accomplishment all pressed into, 4 verses. And when we read this, we think, all right, Solomon seems to have had a few houses, some farmland, a ranch, and he's had some people working for him. But if you go back to 2 Chronicles, and if you go back into 1 Kings, where all of these accomplishments are recorded, you'll find that Solomon is responsible for much more than that. 2 Chronicles 8 says that he built at least 5 cities, not just a couple houses. And it says that whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all of the territory that he governed, he built it. Whatever he wanted. And it doesn't appear that anything, or anyone for that matter, stopped him from doing what he wanted to do. Solomon's pursuits reminded me of a time where I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was in a northern suburb of Phoenix called Anthem. Now, pretty much the whole city of Anthem was developed by one real estate investor named Del Rey. And because of that, the whole city was like a monument to this guy. Everything had his name on it. Even the water tower. You know how the water tower has the name of the city on it? It said Anthem by Del Rey. And as you traveled around the town, you got the impression that, Del Rey was pretty proud of his work. And that he took pleasure in everything that he did. It was impressive. The preacher also talks about the industries in which he was involved. If you read 1 Chronicles 27 and 26, you'll find that these farms, agriculture, all of that he was involved in, they're not just hobby farms or small vineyards. Solomon had expanded on entire industries, including fruit orchards, vineyards, wine industry, lumber, logging, as well as livestock that were all begun by his father David. He took them over and made them great. And he also developed all of the irrigation infrastructure that supported all of those enterprises. This is big time economic development. You know what's interesting? Jesus, in Luke chapter 12, he talks about a rich man. Now, in the context of that, and Joel read that this morning for us, in the context of that, Jesus is approached by a man who wants Jesus to settle a dispute over an inheritance. And Jesus was sensing like the spirit of covetousness in this man's heart. And so he tells a parable in verse 15 of Luke chapter 12. He says, "And he said to them, 'Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.'" Sound familiar? And he told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is going to be required of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" It's fascinating that there is a striking similarity to the rich man and his pursuits that Jesus describes in the pursuits of the preacher in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. You know how we say, there's this person once, and we give the impression that we're telling a fictitious story, but we really have a real person in mind, right? It's almost like Jesus is saying, there was this rich man once, kind of like the preacher in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. In both cases, they're trying to use economic development and wealth and the party lifestyle as a means to pleasure. And in the case of the rich man, he gives no thought to what will happen when he dies. He's purely living in the moment. God will have to tell him what the end will be. But in the preacher's case, in Ecclesiastes, he's using his wisdom to consider the ends of his pursuits on his own. And both come to the same conclusion. It's all pointless if this is all there is. Now, Jesus goes a step further than the preacher does. Jesus says, you're a fool if all you do is try to find satisfaction in the wealth of this world and have no relationship with God. That's what Jesus means by being rich toward God, having a relationship, a right relationship with him. Now, what Jesus is not saying is that it is foolish to pursue wealth necessarily. He's saying that the pursuit of wealth at the expense of or without a relationship with God is foolish. Now, the irony is that God has created all of the things that the preacher is working with, and God has he's even given the command to work and to exercise rule and dominion. We see that in Genesis 1. And that's what the preacher's doing. But none of those things were ever intended to be done apart from a relationship with God. And that's where we begin to lose meaning and purpose. You see, Jesus is the means by which we become rich toward God. When we, by faith, are one with Christ and we enter into that right relationship with him, then that is when we're able to think about all of these other things rightly. When we turn to Christ in faith, becoming rich toward God becomes our primary aim. We will seek first the kingdom of God and pursue the other things only as God has intended. And that's where we find joy and satisfaction. Now, verse 8 provides us with three more experiments that the preacher is going to test in search of lasting meaning. He's going to pursue the pleasure of stuff. Okay? In verse 8, he says, I also gathered for myself silver and gold, the treasure of kings and provinces. Now, of course, all of the economic developments from these previous verses would have brought the preacher much silver and much gold. But what I think he's talking about here is something different than just money. I think that the treasure of kings and provinces means that he's also a collector. He's become a collector. All right, we would think of this in terms of maybe, fine china, Persian rugs, Italian shoes and clothing. Whatever the best luxury items that other cultures produce, he's collected them. All right, perhaps you could even say he's a fine art collector. He collects artifacts from around the world, and as such, he's got art galleries and museums. In other words, he's got a whole lot of really cool stuff. But that didn't work. So he tests the pleasure of entertainment. He says, I got singers. I love how I got singers. I just went out and got some. I got singers, both men and women. So he employed the best that the entertainment world had to offer. The hottest stars came and performed for him. But that didn't work, so he tests the pleasure of sex. The preacher says, he got many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. Now, you remember when I said at the beginning that the Bible will often tell us what happened, but that doesn't mean that it endorses what happened? Now, what the preacher engages in here is grossly immoral. What the preacher has done is utilized a culturally acceptable means to sleep with a bunch of women. Now, a concubine is a woman who does not hold the status of wife, but is available to that man for sexual pleasure. In 1 Kings 11:3, it says that Solomon had 300 of these concubines. And that was in addition to his 700 wives. Now, this isn't adultery, and this isn't soliciting prostitutes, but it's not sex within the context of marriage in the way that God has created it either. You see, in Genesis 2, when God creates Eve and brought her to Adam, he essentially performs like the first marriage ceremony. And at the end of that, he institutes this covenant of marriage. Now, the marriage covenant is an idea that is recorded for us in Genesis 2:24. It says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, there's a couple things that we need to notice here. First is the singularity of the relationship. A man, singular, shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, also singular. There's no room for extra people in this design that God has laid out for marriage, besides this one man and one woman. In other words, we could say it's an exclusive relationship. Second thing we should notice is that this hold fast concept, the man is to hold fast to his wife. This is covenantal language, right? To hold fast is to formally commit oneself to his or her spouse. All right? Most cultures do this in some sort of wedding ceremony where vows of fidelity and commitment are made. The formal commitment is what changes the relationship between that man and woman, and it gives them both new titles. Right? A man is to hold fast to his what? Wife. The title wife means that the relationship has changed. He's covenanted himself to her, and now their relationship has changed. She's not a friend. She's not a girlfriend. She's not even a fiancée. She's certainly not a concubine. She's his wife. And I think we could say that the same thing is implied in the title husband as well. Titles mean things. And the third thing that we should notice is that they become one flesh. Now, this phrase has a couple layers to it. The man and the woman who have covenanted together in marriage become one flesh in sexual union and as pictured by the children that they might have. The two become one. So when we look at what the preacher has done in his pursuit of pleasure, in his taking of many concubines, he has gone away from God's design. And the plain truth is that he is using hundreds of women in his little experiment to find satisfaction. They are merely objects to him. There cannot be meaningful relationships between him and 1,000 other women in his harem. Think about it. Solomon could pass a woman in the halls of his palace and think, man, she looked familiar. And he might even ask her, hey, you look familiar. Have we met before? And she would say, yeah, I'm your wife. Or she might say, I'm concubine number 235. But that's sad, right? And it's also sad that, and it's the truth, that so many men and women are trying to find lasting meaning and satisfaction and sexual pleasure in the same way that the preacher did. I mean, most people might not have access to 1,000 women or 1,000 men to satisfy themselves, or do they? I don't know, maybe that's what the multi-billion-dollar porn industry offers. Access to unlimited women. I guess a lot of people are still trying to search for lasting satisfaction in sex. So here's his experiments. What's the outcome? Man, outcome is one can experience a lot of pleasure in many ways. The result of all of these pursuits that Solomon has had, that the preacher has had, is the result of this is that he's become great. He's become great at all of them, to the point where he has surpassed everyone who's come before him. I mean, that's what we find in verses 9 and 10. He says, so I became great, and I surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept from my heart no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all of my toil. So here we do have an important point to consider. You can find some pleasure in all of your pursuits. He's not saying that there was no pleasure whatsoever. He found some. And there was some rewards for all of his accomplishments. But the other thing that we need to notice here, particularly as we look at verses 4 through 10 as like a whole, take all of that into consideration, and what does it look like the preacher's trying to do? Well, many have noticed that when you consider the language that is used in these verses, planted, gardens, trees, fruit, water, work. Man, there are a lot of parallels between this passage in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2. It's like the preacher is attempting to create his own Edenic paradise Except his paradise has no restraints. Now, when God created the universe, and in particular the Garden of Eden, and he placed man in it to work, and then he gave him Eve, what was the end result of all of that? What does God say at the end of all of his creation? Right, it was very good. But what is the result of the preacher's attempt at creating his own Edenic paradise? And that's where we come to the conclusion. Then I considered all that my hands had made or done, in verse 11, and the toil that I expended in doing it. And behold, it was all vanity and striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. The experiment failed. All of the pursuits of pleasure failed to produce the desired result. The commentator Derek Kidner helpfully states, he notes at once the paradox of hedonism, that the more you hunt for pleasure, the less you find of it. It's kind of like the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns says that if you keep increasing one factor in the production process, you'll reach a point where additional increases will actually produce a decline in output. So, for example, a company might hire additional employees to increase production, but the company can hire too many people such that they all get in the way of each other, or there's not enough work for everyone to do, and then production goes down. Pleasure has its own law of diminishing returns. Think about it. That first piece of cake tastes really good, but the 12th one, not so much. That's how addictions work, right? You need more of a stimulant in order to get the same amount of pleasure. And in the end, all of our pursuits of pleasure, in hopes of finding some lasting and meaningful satisfaction, they will fail because they're not designed for that purpose. We can't find pleasure. We can't find in pleasure what can only be found in God. The only lasting satisfaction and meaning and purpose in life can be found in connection with Jesus Christ. You won't find lasting satisfaction in the pursuit of pleasure or anything else. So that calls us then to consider our relationship with God. Are we rich toward God, as Jesus says? Are we united to Christ in faith? Only then can we properly orientate our expectations for these pursuits of pleasure and pursue them in a way that God has intended. As the psalmist says in Psalm 16:11, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." That's where you got to be. At God's right hand, connected with Jesus. Let's pray.